At long last, Vietnam has had enough of China's provocations. And in an epic move, they are telling China to get out now. But what's happening, and why is this such a big deal? This week, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel entered the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam, sparking outrage across the country. For over a decade, Vietnam has been trying to assert its sovereignty in the South China Sea. The area has become increasingly important for the Vietnamese economy, but it's also extremely important for the Chinese Communist Party's dreams of regional hegemony. Vietnam is sandwiched between China and the Pacific Ocean, making it a critical partner in any strategy to contain China. So let's unpack this. The United States, Vietnam, and China all have a major stake in the South China Sea. China is attempting to build a military fortress in the region, while Vietnam wants to protect its own waters and natural resources. This collision of interests is growing by the day. Since 2014, China has been ramping up military patrols in the South China Sea. It's claimed almost the entirety of the sea as its own territory. Despite multiple international rulings that these claims are invalid, as a result, many countries in the region are taking steps to push back against China. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, India, Japan, and Australia are all working closely with the US to try to stop China from dominating the region. And with tensions rising, both sides are now posturing more aggressively than ever. China has become increasingly impatient in recent years. They're now testing the waters with risky maneuvers like sending a Coast Guard ship into Vietnamese waters. This recent incident happened near the Paracel Islands. On May, the Chinese Coast Guard ship entered the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam without permission. To make matters worse, China hasn't even attempted to hide what they're doing. In fact, they seem to be relishing in the controversy. The Chinese government accused Vietnam of being a pawn of the US and said that it was legitimate for their ship to enter the area. But many people in Vietnam saw this as a blatant violation of their sovereignty and a serious provocation. So, how did Vietnam respond? Well, they took an incredibly rare step for a country that usually stays out of the spotlight. Vietnam issued a strong condemnation of China's actions. This is very significant because Vietnam rarely speaks out about issues related to China. They usually prefer to keep a low profile and avoid confrontation. But in this case, they felt compelled to make a public statement. They summoned the Chinese ambassador and lodged a protest against the incursion. The foreign ministry spokesman said this is a serious violation of Vietnam's sovereignty over its land and maritime areas, as well as the basic principles of the international law, especially the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now this is some straight talk from Vietnam. We haven't heard a statement like this in a long time. In fact, this is one of the most forceful statements that we've seen from them in a while. But this isn't just about words. Vietnam has also taken action to protect its waters. They've deployed ships to monitor Chinese activities in the South China Sea. And this is a clear sign that Vietnam is serious about defending its territory. They're not going to stand idly by and watch China encroach on their waters. But what does this mean for the future of the region? Tensions in the South China Sea have been high for years, but things are starting to come to a boiling point. China's aggressive actions are provoking countries all over the world, and it seems like Vietnam has finally reached its breaking point. Now remember, we're living in the era of the Indo-Pacific, which is a region that stretches from the western shores of the Americas through the islands of Southeast Asia and on to the eastern shores of Africa. It encompasses half of the planet's landmass and population. It's also home to some of the most powerful militaries in the world, including those of China, Russia, and the United States. And this is where things start to get interesting. Just yesterday, the US released its Indo-Pacific strategy, and guess what? They're calling out China's dangerous behavior in the South China Sea. The US recognizes that China's actions are destabilizing the region and threatening international norms. That's why they're working closely with countries like Vietnam to counter China's influence. The U.S. is committed to supporting the sovereignty of nations in the region and protecting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. In fact, U.S. has conducted several operations in the region to send a message to China. These operations are designed to show that the U.S. is still a major player in the South China Sea, and that they recommitted to protecting the interests of their allies and partners. But the question remains, what can Vietnam actually do to push back against China? Well, they've got a few options at their disposal. First, Vietnam can continue to build up its own military capabilities. They are already investing heavily in modernizing their armed forces, and this will help them to deter Chinese aggression in the future. Second, Vietnam can continue to strengthen its partnerships with other countries in the region, especially with the United States. Together, they can form a united front against Chinese aggression and protect the sovereignty of each country. Finally, Vietnam can continue to engage in diplomatic efforts to try to resolve the conflict peacefully. This is always easier said than done, but it's important to keep trying to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. But remember, China is a Goliath that cannot be ignored. Their economy is growing by leaps and bounds, and their military is becoming more powerful every day. But Vietnam has a secret weapon that China can't compete with: their people. The Vietnamese people are incredibly resilient, and they're used to overcoming difficult challenges. They've been through a lot of hardship in the past century, but they've always come out stronger on the other side, and this time will be no different. The Vietnamese people are proud, and they don't like being told what to do by China. The Chinese government may think that they can bully Vietnam into submission, but they're wrong. The Vietnamese people will not tolerate foreign interference in their country, and they are willing to fight back if necessary. Now, this doesn't mean that Vietnam wants to go to war with China. War is never the ideal solution, but Vietnam is prepared to defend itself if it comes down to it. And let's not forget about the support that Vietnam can rely on. Countries all over the world have watched as China has grown in power in recent years, and many of them are worried about what this means for the balance of power in the region. These countries are watching the situation in Vietnam closely, and they are ready to support Vietnam in any way necessary if China continues to provoke. There are multiple fronts where China could face trouble. We already mentioned the US, but there are others, like India, for example, who recently clashed with China along their disputed border. India and China have a long history of border disputes, but things came to a head in 2020 when there was a deadly clash between the two sides. Hundreds of soldiers were injured, and many lives were lost. Since then, tensions have remained high along the border, and there are fears that the situation could escalate. The Indian government has been taking steps to protect its territory, including by building new roads and infrastructure in the region. They are also investing in modernizing their military, and they recently announced plans to buy state-of-the-art fighter jets and missile systems. Meanwhile, China is also investing heavily in its military, and they've been conducting live-fire drills along the border with India. It seems like we headed for a showdown between these two giants, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out. But let's switch gears and talk about another potential flashpoint. How about Japan? Japan is another country that has been targeted by China in recent years. China has been encroaching on Japanese territory in the East China Sea, and they've also been conducting military drills near Japanese waters. In response, Japan has been building up its own military capabilities, and they are also working closely with the United States to counter China's aggression. Japan is also pursuing a more active foreign policy in recent years. They've been taking a more assertive stance on issues like human rights and democracy, which has further angered the Chinese government. And that's just the beginning. There are plenty of other countries in the region that could potentially cause trouble for China. For example, Taiwan is a self-governing island that China claims as its own. China has been pressuring Taiwan to unify with mainland China, and they've been offering huge incentives to countries that agree to recognize Beijing's authority over Taiwan. But so far, it doesn't seem to be working. Most countries in the world still recognize Taiwan as an independent country, and they read not about to change that anytime soon. Another thorn in China's side is the Philippines. The Philippines is a key ally of the United States in the region, and they are also a member of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance. This means that China is constantly being monitored by the US and its allies, which makes it harder for them to carry out any covert activities in the region. And let's not forget about the power of the people. As we mentioned earlier, the Chinese government may think that they can bully smaller countries like Vietnam, but the Vietnamese people won't take it lying down. The same thing goes for the people of Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. The people in these countries are proud, and they're not going to allow China to bully them. The people have the power to resist China's influence, and they're starting to realize this. People in these countries are organizing protests and speaking out against China's aggression. This is putting pressure on their governments to take action and stand up to China. Despite these challenges, China is still a formidable opponent, and we shouldn't underestimate their capabilities. Their economy is growing faster than ever before, and their military is becoming more powerful by the day. Plus, they have a large population that they can draw on for military service if needed, so it won't be easy to contain China. But if all the countries in the region work together, it can be done. The key is for countries to continue building up their own military capabilities and to strengthen their partnerships with each other. Only then will they be able to stand up to China and protect their interests. So what do you think? How will this story evolve? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave us a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.